Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. I'm Todd Pover, Senior Wildlife Biologist with the Conserve Wildlife Foundation in New Jersey. And tonight I'm going to be talking to you about piping plovers along the Flyway, New Jersey, Bahamas, and beyond. So to start, I want to talk to you a little bit about the different populations of piping plovers. There's three. There's the Atlantic Coast population, which of course is the one we're familiar with here in New Jersey. There's a small Great Lakes population, only about 70 to 75 pairs, and then a Great Plains population further west. The Atlantic Coast population is listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act and endangered here in New Jersey. In total, there's a population of about 8,000 piping plovers worldwide or North America, including about 4,000 pairs 4,000 individuals here on the Atlantic coast. And that number is derived from the latest number of pairs, about 2,000. And that's a big improvement, increase from when they were first listed in 1986, from when there was only slightly under 800 pairs. That said, most of that increase has been seen in New England, specifically Massachusetts, whereas here in New Jersey, we've struggled a little bit more with recovery, which I'll talk about in a bit. And so, yeah, here we are. Don't get overwhelmed by all the numbers on the page. I'll hit the important parts. Here in New Jersey, over the last 5 years, we've ranged from 96 to 115 pairs. And it's gone up and down, fluctuated, although not too much either way, up or down. The important thing to note about here is our average number of pairs since federal listing has been 116. So none of the last 5 years have been above even our average. And our peak number was 144 a couple decades ago. And then not too long ago, in 2014, we only had 92 pairs in the state, our lowest ever. So, this is some reason for concern. And in fact, there are things happening that would suggest that we should actually be increasing. So that goes to the fledge rate. So the fledge rate is the number of chicks that fledge or can fly in a given year. And on average in New Jersey, we only fledge about one pair, 1.05 chicks on average per pair. The recovery goal is 1.5 chicks, and so that may not seem like much, but statistically, that's a huge difference. In fact, we've only met that recovery goal statewide once in 2018 in the entire time since federal listing. That said, the last 5 years have all been above what we call the maintenance level. So that's the level we need to maintain the population. And so this is the first time we've had such sustained, relatively good productivity in New Jersey. And because the main way that you recover piping plovers is to produce more chicks, the chicks have very strong, well, all of the birds have very strong site fidelity, which means they return to the same area. So if you produce a lot of chicks, the following year or two, they're going to return to New Jersey or at least pretty close to try to nest. So given that pretty robust productivity we've had in the last 5 years, we would be expecting our numbers to go up, and they haven't recently. In fact, the most recent year they went down. So I'm going to park that idea. We'll come back to that, but that's something we want to explore a little more. Just to give you an idea of timing, piping plovers arrive in mid-March, sometimes as early March, so we have a fair number of them back already as we approach April. The males come back first, establish their territories, and the older males are before the younger ones. And then as the females filter back and they pair up, first nests are laid in mid-April, and then mid to late May is our peak laying time, and then hatch in June going into July, and in early July, by 4th of July, we have our first fledglings on the beach. And even by mid-July, the adults and some of those chicks are starting to leave. So this idea of fall migration is really, misnamed to some degree, at least for piping plovers and a lot of shorebirds. Fall migration begins in peak summer. By July and August, most of our chicks have fledged and depart the breeding grounds, but more recent research we've done from banded birds have shown that some of our birds and some of the migrants from further north stay here as late as October, and that's something we didn't really understand or know until the last decade or so. So this is just a picture of what we would expect out on the beach about now. These are some one pair and a male kind of duking it out over a territory. And once they're paired off and they begin laying, I just want to give you an idea what the nests look like. Typically they lay 4 eggs. They're small, like the size of a quarter. They're sand colored to blend in, and despite what some people think, they're generally not in the mature dunes. In fact, they're out on the open beach, the part of the beach that when people are out there to recreate are also using. And that's one of the most important elements of their risk and the way we have to manage them. They're small, they're hard to see. Occasionally, as in the top picture, they are in sparse vegetation. This might be a behavior you're familiar with. This is a plover doing a broken wing display. This is what they do as a predator, or if you as a person approach their nest or just hatch chicks, they pretend they're injured and then they'll lead you away from the nest or chicks. And so if you were a predator, they want you to think you're injured and easy prey. And then of course, once they got well down the beach, away from the chicks and the nest, they'd be able to fly away from the predator. So if you were to see this behavior on the beach, you'd know you were really close to a nest and you should kind of always like step back, especially if you're not in a fence protected area. Some of you may be familiar with this, some other species of plovers or related species. The killdeer often do this at schools and gravel lots. So give it about a month. If the nest isn't lost to predators or some kind of disturbance, abandoned, or flooding, they're going to hatch. Generally hatch at the same time. The adults, and which the adults take turns, by the way, the male and female, incubating the eggs, but they don't start actually incubating until the 4th egg is laid. But in about a month's time, the chicks hatch. They only stay in the nest, or that nest bowl, that shallow nest bowl, for anywhere from a couple hours to maybe the first day, and then they're on their way. Another view of a just hatched nest, and this one's really interesting because you see some color in there. They are some bands, and you can also see a wire on the one. So that's a tracking device we put on them. This is part of a research study recently completed by State University of New York. Because we do have so much difficulty producing chicks, like I said, we are able to hatch our nests pretty good as well as other regions of the range, but actually chick survival is low. So we've been doing some research on which factors impact that chick survival and what we might be able to do to improve it. So these birds are marked so we can track them, find out how long they live, possibly recover them if we do lose them. And especially with the tracking device, we can monitor their movements more closely. Just another picture to give you a sense of the scale when they're first hatched. And actually this one's almost a week old and it's not much bigger than a surf clam. Another picture, although to be honest, I just threw this one in because they're incredibly cute. And so figured we could all use a dose of cuteness in here. So just like it takes about a month for the nest to hatch, it also takes about a month, 25 to 35 days for the young to grow to the point where they can fly. Now, it's important to note that the place they need to go to feed once they hatch is the shoreline, especially the intertidal or surf zone at low tide, and pull those worms that you see out of the low tide surface. They'll also hunt around in the natural rack when it's left on the beach. That's the material that washes up with each tide. So it's really critical that they aren't disturbed during this period. And this is where the management is really tough, because we can put fence around the nesting areas, but we can't fence or entirely protect the area at the shoreline where there's a lot of people. Many of these birds are on public, heavily recreated beaches, not just wildlife refuges and park areas. And so when they have to leave those areas, and I didn't really mention this, but the chicks are never fed by their parents, the adults. They have to feed on their own from the moment they're born. So because of that, they have very long legs and they're very mobile chicks. But it's really critical that they pack on weight and are able to forage undisturbed, particularly in that first week when they're born. So this is just a picture of the chick a little after it was born, and then a fledgling about 30 to 40 days later. So just really quickly about the things we do to protect the birds, and you might already be aware of some of these. But so of course we monitor the location and the distribution of pairs. We track abundance. That's just the number of pairs. Productivity. That's the fledgling rate I talked about, and that's done as part of our federal recovery initiative. But we also try to determine the causes of nest and chick loss that can help us decide if there are things going on that we might be able to address to improve reproductive success. And I already mentioned we put up protective signs and fence at all the nesting sites. We either do that prior to the birds arriving, so right about now, because as I mentioned, they have strong site fidelity, return to the same areas each year, so we kind of know where most of the birds will nest. Although new pairs or young that don't have established territories will seek new areas, so that's part of our job, is to be constantly monitoring the coastal area during the whole breeding season to discover new pairs as well. We work really closely with the towns or the state or whoever owns the nesting site, the land, to minimize their disturbance from vehicles that they may have on the beach to pick up trash for lifeguards, those types of things. And then lastly, we put up predator exclosures, or those cages you see on the bottom there. And these are to protect against predators including avian ones, crows, and gulls, and then mammalian predators such as fox, cats, raccoons, just to name a few. You can see in the really bottom there, the cages, the holes in the cage are small enough that most predators can't get in to get to the eggs, but the birds themselves can get in and out freely to incubate their nest. I will, as I already mentioned, once the chicks are hatched, they leave their nests, so they leave these cages, and the cages really only protect the nests. They do nothing to protect the chicks. In fact, we've unfortunately had some situations where crows, and this is a picture here of Cape May, that's one place in particular where we've had a problem where crows will learn that there's food in there, there's going to be either the eggs and they can't get into them, but they do learn that once the chicks hatch, they'll be able to get them as they leave the cage. So these cages aren't foolproof, but they're just one of the tools we try to use. And then, lastly, we do a tremendous amount of advocacy and education, particularly with the public. We have staff members out on the busy summer days, particularly the weekends, to sort of interact with the public and make sure they understand the purpose of the fencing, stay out of the fencing, and talk to them some other things they can do to help to protect the birds, including not having their dogs on the beach. So that gives you a good idea of what we do in the breeding season and many other states along the range. The birds on the Atlantic coast nest from North Carolina through Maine and then into the maritime provinces of Canada. And most of the sites are doing similar management and monitoring. We believe we do know where most of the birds nest in the U.S. Atlantic coast. It's a little more difficult in some of the Canadian provinces, but still, there's intense monitoring. It's probably one of the most intensely monitored birds, particularly, especially shorebirds in the world. But interestingly, most of our, initially at least, when the birds were listed, a lot of our efforts went into breeding ground monitoring and protection, but we've learned over time that they really only spend a small amount of time here, several months with those outliers, which I already mentioned, that might stay here through October. But most of the birds are spending the majority of their life cycle on the wintering grounds or en route back and forth in migration. And we'll just point out, we don't know as much about migration as we now do about wintering, but even 10, 15 years ago, we knew very little about their wintering grounds. The line you see on here was just sort of a made up projection of where they might have, the route they took. We don't have tracking information for a particular bird that did this, but I will point out that we do know that there's a combination of flying over open water and hugging the coast. There's sort of a mid to long distance migrant relative to other shorebirds. But we are learning that just like with breeding, they are site fidelic to their staging or migration sites as well. And there's a particularly important migration staging area on the Outer Banks of North Carolina near Ocracoke. Research from Virginia Tech and some of their partners have just documented that. And so we know a lot of our New Jersey birds stop there en route to the south. And we also know, and I'm going to talk primarily more about that for the rest of the talk, we know the majority of our Atlantic coast piping plovers go down to the Bahamas to winter, although they're also in the southeast US along the Atlantic coast and Florida on the Gulf Coast. Finally, there are birds in Cuba, Turks and Caicos, so down in the Caribbean, but mostly in the northern part of the Caribbean. So I've personally been involved with piping plovers on their wintering grounds and migration since about 2011. And that's when I joined this effort for the International Piping Plover Census. Now, the census has been conducted every 5 years since 1991, and it supplements the intense annual monitoring we have, but also in places like the Great Plains where they don't monitor every location as intensely. This international census is the main way they found out about their birds for a number of years. And it's really, at this point, important for us to figure out what's going on during the wintering grounds. This is a picture of me in Abaco, one of the main islands in the Bahamas, and where the Conserve Wildlife Foundation has its main wintering project, working with local organizations there, including Friends of the Environment, Bahamas National Trust. And I just want to give you an idea, this is what a foraging flat looks like. It's actually very difficult to detect the birds there. They're sort of even, more harder to detect than they are on the breeding ground. And there are hundreds, and some say thousands, of islands and small islets and keys in the Bahamas where they could be. And I also wanted to point out, just access to the areas is easy. You know, we might think of the Bahamas as a tourist destination. Is true, there are some, but most of the islands are uh, more natural. And not only do we have great sandy beaches and flats that you see in advertisements, but there's a lot of these rock outcroppings that you have to walk around and over to get to those beaches. You have to cross areas of tide to get to the flats that you can see in the upper corner. So the surveying itself, for a number of reasons, is difficult. So going back to the census a little, just prior to 2011, there was sort of a growing consensus that our piping plovers might be in the Bahamas. Some plover biologists had been down there, really not part of his official work, and noticed plovers there. And so starting in the 2011 international census, they decided they would expand the census, and a lot of us from the US and Canada went down to assist Bahamians on this project. And just to give you a comparative, back in 2006, only 66 sites in the entire Bahamas. So, you know, hundreds of miles of beach, hundreds, thousands of miles of beach were not surveyed. So starting in 2011, we did a lot of prep work, and we were able to survey 203 sites. And for the island where I did most of my work then, just to give you an idea, previously only one site had been monitored, but we were able to increase that quite a bit. We also tried to get more local participation as we moved on. And by the time we went back in 2016, we were starting really to see the results of our increased monitoring efforts during these international censuses. So here's an idea. The first three censuses in 1991, 96, and 2001 only detected less than 50 birds in the entire Bahamas. And that was then 2006 was when they were starting to realize there might be more birds there, but still was not anywhere near what expected. Just to give you an idea, at that time, even with intense monitoring on the breeding grounds, all the winter surveys combined only detected about 50, actually slightly less than 50% of the birds we would expect to find. So we knew we were missing them somewhere. And it did turn out that most of the ones we were missing were here in the Bahamas. And, you know, just so you have an understanding, these are not still complete population numbers on the wintering grounds, but they're sort of indexes of birds we found that give you an idea that as time went on, we were realizing, you know, we had more birds there. We still are not able to monitor every single location and site in the wintering grounds. And, you know, earlier I mentioned that we knew that the Atlantic coast population had wintered in the Bahamas. And how do we know that? Again, that was through the banding. And during this period in the 2016, some birds were being banded in the Bahamas itself, but a number of universities and the Canadian government had increased their banding efforts, and in part for this, so we could start to determine where the birds were going, how they were surviving, and where they nested or wintered, or for that matter, migrated, impacted survival rates. Just to give you an idea, that 2016 Bahamas tally represented 35% of the entire winter count. And what I mean by that, the winter count includes those Great Plains and Great Lakes birds, and most of those were not going to the Bahamas, very few in fact. They were going to the Gulf Coast, Texas, and some parts of Mexico, the majority. So prior, the one place that had the most piping plovers was Texas. And again, that was a combination of Great Plains and Great Lakes birds. But you know, the Bahamas counts really drove home that how important it was for Atlantic coast population of piping plovers. So to some extent, you saw, and we've talked about, and you might be familiar with all these intensive monitoring and management we do on the breeding ground. But now that we know they're in the Bahamas, the question is, so what? What do we do about it? And one of the really interesting things was, this is a map of a place in the Bahamas, not Abaco, where I've done my work and Conserve Wildlife does, a little further south, Andros and the Jolter Keys. And we found that from our surveys that about 6% of the global population and 13% of the Atlantic population were on these areas alone. And, we were really, really thrilled that within really short amount of time, not just for Bahamian government, but really ours too, we were able to parlay this new information into getting some of these areas where plovers were wintering designated as new national park. So it's really quite amazing. And in fact, really, it just gives you an idea of how biological monitoring can aid conservation and management. Prior to this, the Bahamians did not necessarily even have shorebirds on their radar as a species to help designate these protected areas. And so this was the beginning of a sort of a new paradigm for looking at their sites. They already knew these areas were important for fish and various species of fish and other important water species. But to have the shorebirds now also in the mix was really critical to getting these areas protected. And I like to show this postcard prior to me going down. When I first went down to the Bahamas, again, plovers were not really on their radar at all, just barely, beginning to be. And this postcard was created sort of 5 years later, and we see that right next to some of those really colorful and important species that Bahamians identify with, including the parrot. We got our piping plover included there on Birds of the Bahamas postcards that you would pick up at the airport and other tourist places. My unofficial, non-scientific indication that our work there has been effective. I would like to mention, as far as the census go, you might have noted that I said they do them every 5 years, and 2021, this past winter would have been a year that we should have been doing another, and you probably guessed it as soon as I said it, but the international census was canceled this year due to COVID. It just was not possible, not only for travel, for international surveyors, but even locals. Folks could not get out to the beaches. Furthermore, some of the islands, including Abaco and Grand Bahama, were still impacted by Hurricane Dorian, which is over 1.5 years ago now. They really don't have the infrastructure set up in a lot of the areas still to even support the surveys. It's rather unfortunate, and we don't know yet what's going to happen, whether the survey will be conducted next year, a year later. So I just wanted to also talk, in addition to our biological research, scientific research we're doing down in the Bahamas, we also, CWF and some of our partners there, particularly on Abaco, we're trying to set up a surveying and volunteer network, citizen scientist program. It was one of our goals. We did receive a grant to help us with this from the Disney Wildlife World Wildlife Foundation. And so we're increasing local capacity to conduct these future piping plover surveys. And it's kind of a shame. They did help, and we had the the survey network in place for that 2016 survey, and we were ready to really test it again in 2021, and we just couldn't because of COVID. We also were able to set up a Facebook page called APCO Piping Plover Watch, where we were able to communicate sort of and increase awareness about piping plovers, specifically on that island, and kind of engage both the general public, but also folks to help us do the surveys, and that's been hugely successful. And so just to, kind of repeat a little bit, but since 2011, when we first started doing our work, and when I say our work, Conserve was one of many partners that helped in this increased focus on piping plovers in the Bahamas. But we've done a really good job, in my estimation, of mapping the wintering distribution of piping plovers, and also use those band sightings to demonstrate strong site fidelity. And so I guess it begs the question, why is band resighting still important moving forward? And the band resighting is one of the important things we do when we say we do wintering surveys. And for a lot of reasons, but one that really stands out is we are still trying to figure out some of the factors, aside from on the breeding grounds, that impact survival and recovery. And because we already mentioned the birds spend most of their time off the breeding ground, so on the wintering ground, what happens there really impacts their survival as much as on the breeding grounds. And I mentioned, that in New Jersey, we've seen really robust productivity in the last 5 years, but we have not had a rebound in the pairs as we would expect it. And one reason for that could be something happening during migration on the wintering grounds. And we know there's been, for instance, some really severe hurricanes that have occurred where we have birds, so based on the banding. So that's something we can try to help monitor, and whether we directly learn that from band resighting and then the bird stops coming back, but we saw it on the wintering grounds, didn't come back to New Jersey. We know we probably lost it down there or on migration. But also through scientific modeling, we can figure out if there's some kind of regional correlation to survival. Just a little bit, if you're interested in the bands, this is actually a flag. You can see the flag, we call it on the top, the green. It extends out from the leg when it's placed on, and then a band, the red band right below it, just wraps more tightly around the legs. Here are some of the variations we typically use. Upper right hand is 4 plastic darvic bands on the upper, and they're birds. We in New Jersey, that's the scheme we primarily use. And so each bird would have a unique color combination, not repeated by another bird. And those bands would kind of tell us the individual, the site, and the year they were banded based on the color. There are some limitations. Eventually, we're going to run out of combinations. We're not there yet. And that's one reason the flags are a little more useful. There's pretty unlimited number of flag combinations, especially if you move to 3 letters and numbers. And typically, in addition to the flag on one leg, you'll see all the birds have at least one band on the other leg. So in combination, we can get a lot out of that. There's just a very slight higher mortality rate associated with some of the flags. So that's one reason we in New Jersey are sticking to just the 4 bands. Of interest, the green flags are primarily used by Virginia Tech and their research projects. The pink bands you see in the bottom were birds that are banded in the Bahamas. There's no current banding being done there now. So we're starting to have very few of the pink bands unless we resume that. And the band in the top left corner there are gray, white, and black bands from Canada. Those are unique. So in addition to the banding work, we are also doing other education and outreach, not just in New Jersey, but in the Bahamas. We're currently, the grant that we're doing on this ran its course, so we haven't continued. And in addition, we did this on Abaco, and again, because of COVID and Hurricane Dorian, we haven't been able to do some of this in the last couple winters. We hope someday to be able to resume this, but just to give you an idea, our main program, our most exciting one, is the Sister School program. And as an example, we pair up schools in the Bahamas and in New Jersey. This one at Green Turtle Key on Abaco, and Ocean City, New Jersey. And so they use the fact that the international link for piping plovers between the US and the Bahamas, and the migration as a basis for this multidisciplinary component of their curriculum, which we help them design. We do in-person visits, usually 2 to 3 a year. And then we have other projects they're working on. It's sad to say the pink schoolhouse, you see the Amy Roberts primary school in the bottom left, was destroyed in Hurricane Dorian, and they're in the process of, or are largely completing, a rebuilding of that school there. Just some other pictures. That's me in the top left doing an in-classroom program at that Amy Roberts school. You can see some of the students on the top right. And then in addition to a number of in-class projects and programs we do, we have a field component. We teach them how to use binoculars and scopes to identify and see the birds. And we have different projects here in the Bahamas. They're doing a habitat enhancement project in the bottom. This is an invasive species, Australian pine, that overtakes the natural vegetation, just like in the US, where they like sparsely vegetated open habitat. They like the same in the Bahamas. This is in part so they can sort of hide in plain sight with their camouflage on the beach from predators. And the trees are perches. They create, or they encroach on and take over or destroy the habitat completely. So the project here was to remove those smaller and medium-sized seedlings and trees before they could destroy it. And this was very successful, although I will have to say, because we had to discontinue the program due to COVID and Hurricane Dorian, I'm a little concerned. These are fast-growing species of trees, and they could have got a foothold again. The other project was to create, using student artwork, we created some signs, both down in the Bahamas and here in the US. So both schools were doing the same thing, and they communicated about it, slightly different issues, but also some common ones. And just to give you an idea, one of the messages here to get the public engaged, the Bahamas, we pointed out that they use a variety of coastal habitats, but tidal flats are especially important for their survival. And noting that the flats are also critical for a number of marine species, bonefish, conch, shark, which have commercial and ecological and ecotourism value in the Bahamas. So we're trying to drive home the point that by saving plovers and their habitats in the Bahamas, you're also protecting and benefiting species that are important for your livelihood. And as I previously mentioned, our partners there were initially the Disney Worldwide Conservation Fund, and also the Friends of the Environment, who we continue to partner with. Just another example of our sign, and this is one of the signs we use, the Ocean City students. And I would point out we're still using these signs here in the US. We have them sprinkled around in New Jersey, so you might see some of them. I know I've seen them in most recently at Barnegat Light, where we have just completed in the last 2 years a habitat restoration project there to benefit birds. Now, our work initially really focused on that link between New Jersey and Atlantic coast and the Bahamas. But we also have begun doing some work with other partners in other parts of the range. And this was one of the most exciting ones for me. When I was down in the Bahamas, we spotted this bird actually on the island of Eleuthera that we reported back. And within a couple of days, folks reached out to us from the White Point Beach Resort in Nova Scotia to tell us that we had seen one of their birds. They have one pair typically that nests at the same. I have to say, I was shocked. I was having trouble getting internet service, basic service there, but somehow they figured out within a couple of days that we had one of their birds sighted. And so I followed up with them after that trip, and we ended up partnering with them for 2 years, and still informally we're in contact. But we initially went up and we were able to host a conference. We declared an International Piping Plover Day there and had a conference. And so all of Nova Scotia were able to bring in they have a very strong conservation project for plovers already, but bring everyone together, give them our perspective from the US and work. And then the second year, we were able to engage the students, sort of similar to our sister school program. We worked with schools up there and linked the schools, the resort. We were able to make some signs to use. And I want to point out, you'll notice in the picture here that has this sign, that's not one of the signs we made, that's the signage they use in Canada. But I will point out that the cobble you see on the beach there, actually, I'm sorry about that. I wanted to point out that the birds do nest in slightly different substrate up in some parts of Canada. They do indeed have sandy beaches, and that picture up in the upper right looks all sandy, but in fact, when you get close down, there's sand interspersed with the cobble rock. And so as you move north in North America, the birds, including in Maine and the US, do change their habitat slightly. The other thing I just wanted to mention about White Point Beach Resort that's really important, I think, is, sometimes we get on this sort of this idea that tourism and commercial, say, beaches are not compatible with conservation. And the resort here in Canada really is a prime example of how you can do both. They actually, instead of shying away from having plovers on their beach, they used it and parlayed it into a way to promote and try to attract people to come to the beach, stay at the beach, so that they could also see plovers. And I think that's much different than, unfortunately, we've seen in many places in the US who are worried because we put up fence, we're restricting the use of the beach. And it's really been successful. To some degree, the birds in that picture in the top right nested far down on the lower part, away from where the hotel was, but people walk down there every day. It was to the point that when you walked in the lobby, they had this large plover you see greeting you when you came in the lobby of the hotel. So quite amazing. In addition to the work there in Nova Scotia, then we took it even another step. We started working with students and teachers and schools in Ontario. Now, this is interesting because this is the Great Lakes population, not the Atlantic coast. And so we tried to do a sister school connection with them, but instead of linking them up with a school in the Bahamas, more of their birds migrate to Southeast US. So we worked with a school in St. Petersburg, Florida, and again, did a sister school with them for a year. So there's really, this program is really exciting. That it's unlimited how we could link with the right resources, and we can link schools all across their range. And we did some of the same things. We visited, and again, in addition to working with just schools, the community there was interested in our perspective on plover protection, and so we worked with the folks at Sowell Beach. And again, just like those in Nova Scotia, their shirts, they have shirts that say, "I'm a plover lover." They had a beer that had piping plover as their emblem. So they really, again, have embraced plovers at a community and sort of at various levels, which is not to say that they do not have detractors and there's not some conflicts, but it was refreshing to see this side of it as well. And it's just a photo of the beach in St. Petersburg where we did the sister school, and we did a number of programs down there as well. We did an outdoor art display during some festivals. That's all student art. It was quite remarkable. And that artwork was then used on signs that are out at the nesting sites, and they're sort of complementary to the agency signs that say, do not enter, and that's part of an ongoing current effort to sort of soften the message and hoping that people might be more engaged and comply with the rules with the children's artwork. We also did some beach field trips there and kind of made the beach a field lab for the day. Similar to some summer beach camps we have pioneered here in New Jersey for piping plover and beach nesting birds. Again, another exciting project which we hope to, if we can secure additional funding, continue in the future. So normally at this time, if we were doing a live program, we'd had a question and answer. We don't have the ability to do that tonight. But I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I really only scratched the surface of these programs, but I think, sort of the key of what we're trying to achieve here is sort of engage the public, link the public through these sort of international projects. It's not just sort of taking the conservation to the next level, but to be honest, in the recovery plan, the federal recovery plan for piping plovers, there is a whole section on winter and migration, and that had, I wouldn't say neglected, but it hadn't been focused on as much. And so this is part of just a general trend in the last decade of increasing all those kind of programs, from the science to the monitoring and management to the outreach and advocacy, not just on the breeding grounds. So if you do have questions, I really, really would encourage you to go to our website. It's kind of easy to find if I have the link on the bottom, but just, search for Conserve Wildlife Foundation of New Jersey, and then you can explore under our Protecting Wildlife. We have all our projects listed, and so under the plover, there's a specific Bahamas one that has a lot more information than I could present on tonight. There's blogs, all kinds of things that if this really piqued your interest, you could go and read more. I will also mention that piping plovers are just one of the projects that Conserve Wildlife Foundation does. We do everything from eagles, ospreys, and peregrines to tiny salamanders, and pretty much everything in between, although our focus is the endangered and threatened rare wildlife of New Jersey. We're the only organization in the state that focuses exclusively or most primarily on that. So all that information is here. And I do want to mention we are a nonprofit organization. We do rely on donations and grants. So if you're feeling in a generous mood and appreciated the program tonight, you can go on our website and donate as well. And it's a little hard to see, but we also have some really cool stuff in our store. We just ordered these piping plover hats really just last week. They became available, so you can be the first one to own your New Jersey piping plover hat if you wish to. So I think that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I at least got you started and provided some information you might not have known about making plovers. Have a good evening, and I really look forward to the time when we can join you in person again, hopefully very soon.